Good evening. I'm Lonnie Stonich, the Executive Director of the Family Action Network, and I'm so excited to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Dr. Dilip Jeste and Professor Howard Nusbaum. Thanks for attending, and a special hello to the many individuals from UC San Diego and the University of Chicago who have registered. FAN is a nonprofit organization that presents a high-quality speaker series offered free to the public on a wide variety of topics, including human development, mental health, education, and social justice. We have over 100 videos of past events archived on our website and on our YouTube channel, so please be sure to explore. It's my honor to introduce tonight's featured guests. Dilip Jeste is the Senior Associate Dean for Healthy Aging and Senior Care, Estelle and Edgar Levy Memorial Chair in Aging, Director of the Sam and Rose Stein Institute for Research on Aging, Distinguished Professor of Psychiatry and Neurosciences, all at the University of California, San Diego, and he is the co-director of the UC San Diego IBM Center on Artificial Intelligence for Healthy Living. Dr. Jeste's main areas of research include schizophrenia, neuropsychiatric interventions, and successful aging. He is past president of the American Psychiatric Association and the American Association for Geriatric Psychiatry. His most recent book, Wiser, The Scientific Roots of Wisdom, Compassion, and What Makes Us Good, was recently released. Howard Nusbaum is the Stella M. Rowley Professor of Psychology and of the Committee on Computational Neuroscience, and a member of the Grossman Institute for Neuroscience, Quantitative Biology, and Human Behavior, all at the University of Chicago. He is the founder and director of the Center for Practical Wisdom, also at the U of C. Professor Nusbaum has edited 5 books on topics ranging from mechanisms of perception to psychophysiology to wise reasoning. He has published over 100 peer-reviewed journal articles on perception and perceptual learning, sleep consolidation, absolute pitch, neural mechanisms of speech perception, environmental neuroscience, neuroeconomics, hallucination, and wisdom. I love that buffet right there. So now let's welcome Dr. Jeste and Professor Nusbaum.
It's a pleasure to be here. And once again, thank you, Lonnie and the Family Action Network. I also want to thank Professor Howard Nusbaum for taking time to be here. Howard and I met for the first time about 5 years ago when he had a meeting of his Center for Practical Wisdom, which brought together wisdom researchers from all over the world. Let me have Howard talk about his center.
Thank you, Dilip. So it's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate Lonnie and Fahn's invitation, and Dilip including me in this conversation. The Center for Practical Wisdom at the University of Chicago was started with support from the John Templeton Foundation. Its origins were actually in a grant program that we ran at the University of Chicago with John Cacioppo to fund 20 investigators, young investigators, untenured researchers, to study wisdom from areas like neuroscience, psychology, classics, philosophy, economics, computer science. And over the years, we've basically developed a center, a YouTube channel, a newsletter, to basically do 2 kinds of things to support our wisdom research, but also to basically bring information about wisdom research, like Dilip's work at San Diego, Igor Grossman's work at Western Ontario, various people around the world, to bring that research to a broader audience to be able to understand wisdom research. I first met Dilip through his research. Dilip was the first person actually to start writing about the neurobiology of wisdom, which seemed like a radical thing to do because a lot of the work on wisdom was very behavioral, was very abstract, and didn't talk about the connections to the brain. And Dilip's own research connected aspects of wisdom and made me think about the fact that wisdom has components, it has structure to it. And those components are not totally independent, but they can be located in various aspects of neural processes. So it's my pleasure to actually I'll be able to talk to Dilip tonight, and I turn the floor over to you, Dilip.
Thank you, Howard. So Howard and I decided that I will begin with a short presentation with slides to summarize the main points about wisdom. And after that, we will have a discussion between ourselves. So let me share my screen. And okay. Okay. So wisdom is a personality trait. It's a personality trait like resilience, optimism, loneliness. But it's a complex trait in the sense it has several specific components. And what are those components? One is self-reflection. It is ability to look inwards and try to understand ourselves. Second is empathy and compassion. Empathy means understanding someone else's emotions. Compassion means acting on them, helping others. There is also self-compassion, that is helping yourself. Then comes emotional regulation, that is control over one's emotions. Next one is a balance between decisiveness and uncertainty. On the one hand, we have to accept the fact that there is no one right way. Different people have different perspectives, so we can be uncertain and yet accepting of diverse perspectives. At the same time, we need to be decisive when needed. And finally, spirituality, which refers to constant connectedness with yourself, others, with God, nature, whatever. So these are the components of wisdom according to the literature, and these are also the components in the scriptures. How do you measure wisdom? There have been several scales. We developed a scale a few years ago. That is San Diego Wisdom Scale, or SDWISE. This scale measures every one of the components of wisdom that I mentioned and gives scores for each of them as well as the total. This scale has 28 items for 7 components, so 4 each. And each is to be rated on a scale from 1 to 5. 1 is strongly disagree, 2 is disagree, 3 neutral, 4 agree, and 5 strongly agree. And a couple of examples of the items. One is, it is important that I understand the reasons for my actions. This is self-reflection. Another is, I have trouble thinking clearly when I'm upset. This is opposite of emotional regulation. There are some items that are positively worded, some are negatively worded. So if you complete this scale, you will get a score then on each component of wisdom as well as the total. As Howard mentioned, one of the specific areas we are interested in is the neurobiology of wisdom. Which parts of the brain are important for different components of wisdom, like empathy, compassion, emotional regulation, and so on? There are 2 main areas of the brain that are involved. One is prefrontal cortex, and second is limbic striatum. In the prefrontal cortex, the main areas are dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and anterior cingulate. And in the limbic striatum, the main area is amygdala. We talk about wisdom increasing with age. It's not clear, and we will talk about that in our discussion. But you should know that there is something called grandmother hypothesis of wisdom. Most vertebrates die soon after losing fertility. This is Darwin's hypothesis of survival of the fittest. Animals don't live after they stop reproducing. However, that doesn't apply to humans. Humans live long after menopause in women or andropause in men. And right from the ancient times, older humans have helped the younger generation in multiple ways, including assisting in foraging, communicating ecological and cultural knowledge, increasing younger individual survival. So they are transmitting wisdom to the younger generations. There is some hardcore research that has been published in major journals like Science and Nature. Number of researchers have shown that bottlenose dolphins, killer whales, species of bird called Sacheris warblers, and humans, in these species, when grandma GM helps her adult daughter D in raising her children, this adult daughter D lives longer, is happier, and produces more children than her mom did. And there is greater happiness, health, and longevity in all three generations. So, although older humans do not reproduce, they contribute to the species survival by helping the younger generations. Can we become wiser? Because I said that wisdom is a trait. Most traits are only partially inherited, only about 50%. That means 50% is determined by environment and behavior. In other words, the traits are modifiable to some extent. And we'll talk about whether wisdom increases with aging, likely it does, and increases with experience. It is actually interesting to point out that there is some very well-done research showing that components of wisdom can increase with psychosocial or behavioral intervention. Recently, we published a paper in JAMA Psychiatry, which was a meta-analysis of 57 randomized controlled trials of behavioral intervention to improve empathy, compassion, emotional regulation, and spirituality. And nearly half of the studies showed that yes, you can improve these components significantly. What we will be talking about, though, is more practical wisdom. How can we develop a habit of making wise decisions in our everyday life? I'm a physician, and so I treat people with disorders. So does wisdom have anything to do with disorders? The answer is yes. For example, autism spectrum disorder is characterized by deficit in cognitive empathy. So there is difficulty in understanding another's emotions. Antisocial personality disorder is associated with lack of compassion. Impulse control disorder, there is dearth of emotional regulation. In OCD or obsessive compulsive disorder, there's too much self-reflection, too much self-preoccupation. So what we need to do is actually reduce self-reflection. For people in palliative care, hospice care, spirituality is now an accepted mode of treatment that is reimbursed by Medicare as well as other insurance companies. And finally, there are specific brain injuries as well as specific neurological disorders like frontotemporal dementia that are associated with loss of several components of wisdom. So there, actually, we will need an intervention that addresses all of those components. Now, switching a bit to technology, artificial intelligence or AI really has now become a part of our everyday life, and it is growing fast. However, what we need is not smarter AI. We need artificial wisdom. Is that possible? I think that is possible, although it will require some collaboration between computer scientists, engineers, mental health experts, and so on. But I expect that the future robots will serve as personal assistants, peers, and coaches that will help improve individual and societal well-being. These robots will have ability for self-reflection and self-correction. They will accept diversity of perspectives and people. They will help make compassionate decisions, not just smart decisions, but compassionate decisions. Next one emotional regulation. Machines don't have emotions. However, they can teach their human users how to regulate or control their emotion. And finally, ethics and morality. This can be incorporated in the future artificial wisdom. Now, I was talking about the individual level wisdom, but what about societal wisdom? Today, and for the last several years, and probably a couple of decades, we have been living in a highly stressed, polarized, angry, anxious, depressed society. And it is happening all over the world. In the last 20 years, there has been a pandemic of loneliness, suicides, and opioid-related deaths of despair. We talked about SDYs, which assesses individual wisdom. Can there be an index for societal wisdom? I think so. And this is something we can again discuss later. But I do believe that we need a solution for this highly stressed, polarized, angry, anxious, depressed society. And that comes from teaching wisdom. If we practice the components of wisdom like compassion, self-reflection, acceptance of diversity, and if we teach them to our students, businesses, and maybe even our politicians, I think the society will become wiser and those stresses will go down. So if we did all this, I think we can transform today's lonely, distressed, and polarized world into happier, healthier, and wiser society. So let me stop here and then have Howard start the discussion. Let me stop sharing the screen. Okay.
Well, thank you, Dilip. That was very clear, and it's always a pleasure to hear you present a view of wisdom, especially so clearly and well structured that people can understand the structure of your book as well. So I think it would be interesting for people to hear, how did you get interested in studying wisdom? You're a doctor. I mean, there isn't a medicine of wisdom as a specialization that I know of, and I'm pretty sure you didn't do your internship in wisdom. So how did you get interested in studying wisdom?
Thank you for a very good question. So I was born and brought up in India, and like many Oriental cultures, there's a belief that older people are wiser. And so that stayed in my mind. I didn't do much about that. So years later, I migrated to the US. I became a psychiatrist and then specialized in geriatric psychiatry. But one of the questions I always had was, how come people get older and then how come the lifespan continues to increase? Because as I said, it doesn't fit Darwin's hypothesis of survival of the fittest. They don't reproduce and yet the average lifespan is increasing. So old age must bring something positive. And is that wisdom? Going back to my upbringing where older people are thought to be wiser. So that got me thinking about wisdom. And then in my own research, I do research on schizophrenia in aging. And even in that population, seriously mentally ill older people, I found that as those people get older, their physical health declines. However, their mental health improves. They become happier. And subsequently, we did a study in the general community, and we found the same, what I call paradox of aging. Physical health declines with aging, the mental well-being improves. And so why does it improve? Is that wisdom? So that got me thinking about studying wisdom as a scientific construct.
That's great, and it's interesting because I think that was Paul Baltus's one of the pioneers of wisdom research. Also, he was a geriatrician studying geriatric psychology, and all around, as a cognitive psychologist, you study aging decline, you see working memory get worse, you see people being more judgmental in some ways, and he wanted to find the positives of aging. So you and he shared that motivation. And I think it's interesting, there was a note that came in from Vivian Clayton, who's also one of the pioneers, and she wanted to tell you that she's very pleased that your research supports her multidimensional analysis of wisdom introduced in the 70s. And so there is this continuity, but the density of wisdom research has been increasing in recent years. How did you decide to develop your own SD-wise scale?
Before answering the question, just a word about Vivian Clayton. I'm just delighted. She's really a true pioneer in the field, and both Baltis and Clayton actually are the two most important initial researchers. And whereas Baltis focus on cognition, Vivian Clayton focused also on compassion, emotion, and reflection. So really amazing thinking. And when she was a graduate student at that time, so just brilliant work. So one question as a scientist, to study something, you need to be able to measure it. So it was important for us to develop a scale for wisdom. So as I said, we started by looking at the literature on different definitions of wisdom, and then we found that some components were common. Those are the ones I presented: self-reflection, emotional regulation, empathy, compassion, so on and so forth. And we found that those components were also present in some of the ancient scriptures. So it looked like the basic concept of wisdom had not changed. So we thought it was important now for us to measure each of those components of wisdom. So we developed this scale, San Diego Wisdom Scale, or SD-WISE, with a colleague of mine, Michael Thomas, wonderful wonderful expert in psychometrics. So this scale is a 28-item scale. There are 4 items for each of the 7 components. And we did a study of more than 600 people, first time, and another larger sample later on, in order to establish the reliability and validity of the scale.
So it's interesting that you talk about emotional regulation, which is not common to all views of wisdom, but it, as you say, Clayton brought it up, Monica Ardelt has been concerned about it. So one of the questions that actually came across was very interesting. Someone asked, do wise people get frustrated at work? How do they feel anger? How do they use anger? And that issue about emotional intelligence, which is not exactly the same as wisdom, is an interesting one. So how do you see the relationship between emotional self-regulation, emotional intelligence, and wisdom?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. I mean, even wise people do get frustrated at work or at other places. I mean, that is just a part of normal life. The question is, what do you do with it? So when something goes wrong, you are frustrated. One of my favorite examples is road rage. I'm driving to work, I'm getting late, and somebody just cuts in front of me. I'm so angry. I can't control myself. And people typically start shouting, screaming. They will try to practically rear end the other car. That's not really helpful. A wise person would control the emotions. So you say that this kind of anger is not going to help me. So let me think about why that a person cut in front of me. It may be because that person had a child sitting in the back seat of the car, and that child suddenly took ill. Maybe they threw up or had a seizure. If you were in that person's shoes, wouldn't you also try to rush to the emergency room? Also, you try to distract your mind from that. So increase the volume of the music you are listening to. Another thing is you accept the fact that you are angry, and that's okay, it's normal, but let's move on. So this is what a wise person would do when he or she is emotionally frustrated. Your point about emotional intelligence is very well taken, too. So people have talked about emotional intelligence, but I don't think there is a consensus definition or consensus tool for measurement. So it is somewhat vague concept, but it does include emotional regulation. But emotional regulation also has another angle to that, which is emotional regulation with positivity. So there should be contentedness that also goes with emotional regulation.
So it's interesting, your example is great because it brings together both the notion of self-reflection, not just reflection on oneself, but reflection on others, perspective taking, the ability to sort of think about what other people might be doing, why they might be doing, what they're feeling. And if you realize that somebody's feeling panic about their child, of course, they're not going to be thinking about you. They're going to be thinking about getting their kid to the ER. But at the same time, there's this issue about self-regulation and self-control. So how do you think these things come together? In other words, these are different kinds of capabilities. One person may be very emotionally controlled. They could be a psychopath and emotionally controlled, if you will. But they may not, in fact, be very thoughtful. They may not be taking the perspective of others with compassion, because it's not just taking the perspective of others, that is understanding others, but understanding them with compassion. So how do you see these things coming together?
But thank you. This is really a very important point, and I'm glad you asked that question. As I said, there are different components of wisdom. The most important to me is empathy and compassion. Because in a way, the purpose for wisdom is improving the well-being of self as well as others. And so psychopaths, they often have very good self-reflection. They have emotional regulation. They can understand different perspectives. They are decisive. So they may seem to have all of the other components of wisdom. What they lack is compassion. So they use those other components and they understand other people. But instead of using that knowledge to help others, they use that knowledge to hurt others. And that also helps us raise the issue about intelligence versus wisdom. Many of these psychopaths are very intelligent. And yet, nobody will say that they are wise. And the reason is, again, this lack of empathy and compassion. And in all our religions, also, we can recognize that empathy and compassion are thought to be the most important part of growing up. And in a way, as parents also, when we raise our kids, we teach them to not only control their emotions, not throw temper tantrums every time they don't get anything, but also share their toys with their sibling, share their toys with neighboring kids or other kids in the classroom. So empathy and compassion are integral, essential component of wisdom.
So I think that's interesting, because there is this debate that arises every once in a while. I think you've heard Bob Sternberg get a little exercised about the importance of morality. Nancy Snow, a philosopher who is the director for the Institute of the Study of Human Flourishing at Oklahoma, once raised this little controversy with me, where she envisioned the notion of a wise woman whose son is struck down early in his life, and she becomes bitter. And so she was wise, but she becomes bitter. And so Nancy asked the question, could there be evil wisdom? And I think from your previous answer, I have a hint of what you'd say, but I'm curious, how do you address that notion of evil wisdom?
I don't think there is such a thing as evil wisdom. Wisdom cannot by definition be evil. Wisdom by definition has to be pro-social. However, your point is well taken. In this, I think the compassion it comes in different sizes and shapes. And there is something called dark compassion. For example, I may belong to a small group of people who are gangsters, people who belong to mafia family. Those people are very compassionate to one another. They will do anything to save the people in their family, but they are very angry and they won't mind killing 10 people in the opposite gang. So that is an example where you are so closely attached, so warmly attached to some people close to you. But then you lose that compassion entirely when you're dealing with your enemies, what you perceive as enemies. So that is not compassion. Typically, compassion would mean being kind, not only to your family and friend, but to strangers. So somebody who lacks that compassion will be the person, even though that person may be kind to the family and friend, that person is not wise if they don't have compassion toward other people.
That's great. I think that's a really important point because we can see people who emulate compassion. We can see people who care about their family, obviously. But what's interesting to me is you use the term, the Aristotelian term, practical wisdom with your slides. And people may not understand, but how do you see compassion as practical? In other words, how does having compassion for someone feed into the notion of practical decision making and practical wisdom?
I think compassion is helpful not only for other people, it's helpful for oneself. If I am compassionate to other people, then it is very likely that they will be compassionate toward me. Uh, and also, you create a role model of socialization. Humans are social by nature. By the way, the word Homo sapiens means wise man. So, so humanity is associated with wisdom, and wisdom has to have compassion. We won't survive as a society if we didn't look after one another. If we were very aggressive and we killed one another, there will be no more human species, right? So we need compassion for the species to survive. And that's why it is stressed in all religions, philosophies, right from the beginning of humanity. So, although it is for others, in a way, it is selfish also, in the sense that I will have a larger circle of friends if I'm compassionate to them. If I'm not, it will become smaller. But when I talk about compassion, it also includes self compassion. I often see people who are very compassionate to others, physicians, for example, priests, they're very compassionate to others, but they can be harsh on themselves. I mean, I have seen physicians, for example, who would blame themselves for even the tiniest mistake they make. And I think that's not very helpful. So just like you need to be kind to others, you need to be kind to yourself. At the same time, self-compassion is different from narcissism. So it is not that everything you do, you love it. You have to, there needs to be self-reflection in which you look at your limitations as well as strengths.
I think that's a very important point. If you think there's something you touched on for just a moment, which was that um, compassion sort of returns to you in some sense. It's a feedback mechanism, if you will. Janice Kaplan wrote a book called The Gratitude Diaries. And in one of her chapters, she talks about the surprise that when she showed gratitude to other people, they showed gratitude to her. And she started to feel better about herself as feeling better about other people. And I think that's an interesting point. And it certainly could be what Aristotle was referring to when he talked about phronesis and practical wisdom leading to human flourishing. But you raise the issue of a doctor who's compassionate to others and not compassionate to herself, being harsh on herself. And that raises another kind of question for me. How do you think about the difference between an expert doctor and a wise doctor? So consider the expert surgeon who, this neurosurgeon is the best neurosurgeon in the world. Everyone is wanting them to operate on their tumor. But what's the difference in that expert surgeon and a wise surgeon?
That's a very good question. And this is actually an important question right now in the medical field. The number of suicides among physicians have been increasing. They have been increasing also among medical students. And I think what happens is in our training in the medical school, the focus is on hard skills. How do you make these students into the best physicians in the sense of diagnosing diseases and treating diseases? We teach them the hard skill. We don't teach them the soft skills, which are essential not just for surviving, but for thriving. And those soft skills are really the skills of wisdom. We don't, in the medical school or in any other school for that matter, we don't have classes on how to increase self reflection, how to increase empathy and compassion, how to increase emotional regulation. We need that to reduce our tension, anxiety, depression, and feel happy. Because that is not happening, because we are not teaching them, that's why the stress level is increasing. And that's why the number of suicides is really increasing, both in medical students and in physicians. So that's the difference. The wise physician would be somebody, obviously he or she needs to be competent in the skill, but that's not enough. You want to care for the patients. You want the patients to feel that you care for them, not just come and do surgery, which is great, but they also need that. And once you do that, then they will return the favor and you will feel much more appreciated. One of the reasons why there is a burnout among physicians is often the lack of feeling of gratification. Because the way it happens, if you treat 9 patients well and one patient, there is some problem, there's a lawsuit or something happens and the patient doesn't do well, you feel guilty, you feel bad. And that really doesn't contribute to your well-being, and that will be reflected in your practice. So it's really important that we try to make the physicians not only skilled physicians, but also wise physicians.
I think that's a great point. It's an important point too, because, for example, chronic pain patients who aren't really cured, they have their pain mitigated, but they're not cured by physicians. Actually, doctors don't like to see them. So they see them for less time. They don't treat them with the same respect on average and so forth. And you're absolutely right that they feel bad about themselves because they want to help the patient and they know they can't. And this issue about burnout is something that American medical colleges have started to recognize, changing the sort of medical school curriculum a little bit, requiring more behavioral science and psychology for physicians as well as chemistry. What's interesting is there are a couple of places that have started talking about training physicians in Loris Kaljan, who is one of the first people we supported from the Templeton Foundation, is a physician at University of Iowa who trains his doctors, medical students in wisdom and thinking about wisdom. But it's not easy. How do you teach someone wisdom? How do you convey wisdom? So engineers have the same problem of burnout. They have the same interest of ethics and helping people, but how do you train someone to have wisdom?
So we have to look at the individual components of wisdom and then how can we increase them. And again, different people, all of us have strengths and limitations. So all of us have, say, I may be strong in self-reflection, but may not be as strong in, say, decisiveness. So we need to find out what we are strong in and what we are limited in. And that's where this San Diego Wisdom Scale is helpful in terms of trying to find out which are your strengths and weaknesses. There are then actually interventions, and as I said, these are evidence-based interventions now for things like emotional regulation, spirituality, and empathy and compassion. So taking the example of compassion, for example. So the way it can be improved is by doing several different things. The first thing I want to stress is this should become our second nature. It should become a habit, just like physical exercise. If I exercise for 2 hours vigorously 2 days a week, and then I forget about it, that's not going to be useful. It's better to exercise half hour every day for the rest of my life. Similarly, we need to form habits. So one habit is keeping a gratitude diary. So before going to bed, write a couple of things that made you feel grateful for something that people had done that you really feel happy about. You can also write things that you did that made you feel proud. So it can be self-compassion also. Another is what one may call random acts of kindness. If we just decide that every day we'll try to help 1 or 2 strangers in some way or another, I think once we start thinking about that, we'll find ways in which we can actually do that. Other ways are meditation, mindfulness, and there are again number of courses for training people in meditation and mindfulness. And they help understand the others, establishing a real connection with other people in which you empathize with them, and then you can go out and help them.
That's great. It's great to think about systematic practices, not just that could be taught, but anybody could practice, things that people could do for themselves. You don't have to go to medical school to learn wisdom. You can keep a gratitude diary and you can practice mindfulness. I mean, I think that's really important because it's an important message that we are not getting out to the world. But that brings up another kind of issue. One of the questions that was submitted said that in the culture that we have today, there's increasing skepticism about knowledge and elites. And in some sense, seeking wisdom or becoming wiser is like becoming more elite. And so how do we change society? How do we promote the value of wisdom in society so that there's a recognition of its importance, that everybody sort of can buy into it and get behind it?
Thank you. Again, that's a great question. One thing to stress is wisdom is associated with humility. So the self-reflection part actually talks about humility. And I think Socrates said that anybody who thinks he is wise is not a wise person, because a wise person knows how much he or she doesn't know. So it is very, so wisdom and elitism really won't go in the same sentence. So when people claim they are wise, often they are not, because a wise person will always question his or her own wisdom. And isn't it true that if we start accepting the diverse perspectives, we start accepting the need for people of different kind. So everybody in the society need not be wise. Everybody in the society need not be intelligent. So there are people who have disabilities, physical, cognitive, mental, and they help the society. So similarly, there can be people who may not be strong in self-reflection or emotional regulation. So we need to accept them and of course think about how we can help them so they will have greater well-being. So a real wise person, actually, I don't see it as being an elitist person, but somebody who will accept these diversities and uncertainties and yet be compassionate to help others.
I think that's a great point. This issue about people's diversity and acceptance of it is critical, given the nation's racial reckoning and the clear problems we have with tolerating differences of any type. What are the implications for wisdom and wise leadership? In other words, given what you just said, what is the role for something like wise leadership in the country?
I really think that there should be a requirement for having this training, but I really think it needs to start at all levels of the society. I mean, I think right from kindergarten, we need to have classes on empathy, compassion, emotional regulation, self-reflection. These are essential for happiness, health, longevity. And this is not some feel-good TV science. This is based on hardcore science that is there, including neurobiology that supports that. And it won't start with just focusing on a small group of people, say politicians, for example. I think it needs to start, the whole society needs to become wiser. You know, in the schools, now we have classes for physical, at one time, all the classes were on reading, writing, arithmetic. Then we introduced classes for physical activity, which is great. Then there were classes for arts, which is great. There are classes now for sex education, which is great. There are, now some places there are classes for minority acceptance, diversity, etc., and that's all great. Why don't we have classes on self-reflection, emotional regulation, empathy, compassion, and so on? That should become an integral part of our thinking. So that's something the parents will teach their kids. The teachers will, and mentors will teach their trainees. The businesses will expect from their workers and help the workers grow it. And same thing will apply to these professions, medicine, law, engineering. I think if we do that, it will percolate to the politician level too. So, but it can't start with politicians. That's unlikely. So if we start at the bottom up, that is what is needed.
So we've been talking about making people wiser, name of your book, Wiser, and ways in which individuals can be, shall we say, developmentally shaped to be wiser, the practices individuals can engage in to be wiser. And ultimately, then you were talking about a wiser society, if you will. That being a wiser society is one that's constituted of wise individuals. But could there be a wise organization or a wise institution? Maybe the individuals are not all wise themselves, but maybe the institution is wise. How would that work?
No, I think that that's really what should be the goal, that everybody, the organization we belong to, whether it's a school, it's a business, professional school, or whatever it is, there actually it needs to start from the leadership. In the sense, the leadership needs to decide that one of our goals for the next 5 years is to raise wisdom. Now, these big tech companies, actually, they have done a great job in improving the lifestyle of people at work. For example, Google, I mean, there are gyms at work. You can get healthy food that you want at work, which is great. But how can we help people improve their wisdom? So there should be classes, courses, encouragement. People should be rated on that. And those who do well should be rewarded. Again, this needs to be a part of our everyday life. Then it will increase. And that applies to, again, every sector, from media to writers, authors, and almost any sports. I think what happens is when we make winning the only goal in life, that's not always conducive to wisdom. Because then it is me versus others, and I have to beat others. Instead of that, if we have compassion, we win jointly. So I can win without defeating somebody else. We both can win. And that's the kind of philosophy I think that is needed, which will help the businesses succeed. And also people will become happier, live longer, and it's great for the society.
So I think that's an excellent point, because it's not just that the individuals become wiser, it's that the leadership encourages policies that by their institution change the goals and change the values of society to seek cooperation, to seek working together, to seek and value caring together as fundamental principles. So in that context, there are institutions, of course, that although they're maybe checkered in their past, seem to take that as their goal, which is religious institutions. And on the one hand, you cited spirituality as an important part of wisdom, but you did, I think, mention in passing that maybe you don't have to be religious. So how do you connect the notion of spirituality without religion or with religion to wisdom?
Right. So the spirituality and religiosity are different. Religiosity refers to specific organized religions with specific practices, whereas an atheist can be spiritual. It is really means connection to nature, and whatever you call that. It can be God, and that'll be fine. But so long as you have that constant sense of connection, that is important. One other point actually I wanted to make about the leadership here, that the more we have women in leadership, the better it will be for the society. Because there is considerable research that shows consistently that women have greater compassion than men. And this has a biological basis. This has been shown even in animals. And there are some biological explanations, such as oxytocin and so on. And studies also show that sort of wise leadership, as you said, and wise leadership, whether it is religion, politics, school, doesn't matter, anywhere. But the more we have women in those positions, I think the more the society will become wiser.
That's great. I think we can all recognize that there's an importance in the way our current culture socializes people to have goals. Men and women have different approaches to things. And I think our female leader is about to join us in 1 second. But I just wanted to ask one last question very quickly. You mentioned artificial wisdom. And of course, I can't get Siri to stop popping up on my phone. I wish she were wiser. I wish she had compassion and didn't bother me. But how do you see artificial wisdom emerging?
No, thank you. So right now, AI or artificial intelligence is a part of actually our daily life. And the artificial intelligence is very smart. It is very intelligent. The machines can do thousands of calculations in no time, right? However, so they make decisions based on fact. They don't take into account compassion, diversity, or helping people in a positive way. So they don't focus on societal well-being. Now, can that be taught to machines? Some things can be taught. I mean, I feel that just like we can teach children, we can teach training, we can teach the machines. The science is growing and it should be possible to do that. Machines won't have emotion. They don't have emotion. They don't have consciousness. But they can help their human users be more emotionally regulated. So I think what is needed here is a collaboration among computer scientists, engineers, mental health experts, ethicists, neuroscientists. I think if we bring these groups together and think about what do we want the future machines to be, not just be masters in chess or Go or something like that, but the machines that actually will help improving the qualities of wisdom in different people.
That's great. Thank you very much, Dilip.
Thank you.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for an excellent conversation. I can tell the questions started early and they hung on through the whole time. So lots of people have lots of questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of them. And so what we'll do is I'm going to go with the upvotes. So we're going to start with Liz asks, what role does trauma, particularly intergenerational trauma, play in the development of wisdom?
That's an excellent question. Trauma can be very helpful in terms of increasing one's resilience as well as wisdom. You know, trauma can have different effects. The same trauma can have different effects on different people. We know all PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, but there are some people who grow from that. So that is post-traumatic growth. And the post-traumatic growth can include not only increased resilience, but people can become more empathic, compassionate, more self-reflective, more emotionally regulated. So it's up to you about how to use the trauma. But the point about intergeneration is very good. I strongly believe that there's a need for intergenerational activities. Older people working with younger ones is mutually beneficial. Older people can transmit wisdom to the younger ones, comes from experience, where the younger people can help the older ones because of their energy, enthusiasm, ability to learn new things like technology. And so intergenerational activities really are an important way to increase societal wisdom.
Thank you. Kashev asks, since there seems to be some scales on measuring wisdom in quantitative terms, can we classify people based on who is more wise and who is not? To that extent, do you think it's a good idea to say, this is the wisest person in the world? If so, based on your experience, who would you say is the wisest person you've met? Besides Howard.
Thank you. So there are several questions there. There are scales for measuring wisdom. As I said, there are about a dozen of them. Our scale is San Diego Wisdom Scale, and we measure each component of wisdom. So wisdom is not yes or no. You know, everybody has wisdom. The question is how much. And it is also not the total wisdom. It is the individual component. As I said, I may be strong in one, weaker in another. So we need to find that out. There are people who are wise, definitely. Typically, the people who are mentioned as wise people are people like Mother Teresa, Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi, and so on and so forth. I think, but these people need not be famous people. I have seen grandmothers in villages who may not even have gone to college. They're the wisest persons in the family. And in my family, actually, I was lucky to have some people, and similarly, some of my mentors who were very wise, and they became great role models for me.
Okay, good. Shannon asks, Dr. Jeste, you approach wisdom as a trait, although you approach it as a trait shaped by experience. Does this open the door to think about the possibility of state-based wisdom, where the pursuit of the state of wisdom leads to change in the trait for wisdom?
Very good question. I believe that wisdom is a trait in the sense we tend to be, there are some people who tend to be always very compassionate and other people who are never compassionate, something like that, right? It is not a state. Where state comes into play are specific components. For example, there are times when my emotional regulation may go down because the trauma is so severe. But my overall level of emotional regulation won't change. So wisdom is primarily a trait. However, the states apply to specific components at different times.
Okay, and I think we have time for one more question. A reminder to everyone, we're going to be having the after hours. It's a much more casual. Everyone's cameras are on. It's a great conversation. It's going to be starting at about 8:05. Access to after hours is gained by supporting the launch of Dr. Jeste's book. We've been putting in links to purchase that book, so go travel there. You'll get the link, will be right in your email receipt. So we'll finish with one last question, and that is from Elizabeth, and she says, in this time of distanced communications, we feel quite alienated from the other and we feel lonely. Is there any evidence that we learn and are reinforced in our learning to a greater degree when we are physically with others?
I think there's no question that physical closeness helps. And this is especially true for older people. For older people, touch is important. They lack the touch. So hugging somebody, embracing somebody, even shaking hands, those are very meaningful. Unfortunately, because of COVID, the distancing is essential to stop the spread of the pandemic. There is no question about that. However, it is physical distancing, not social distancing. I think we really should differentiate the two. That physical distancing is a must, but we can still communicate with people through FaceTime, emails, and videos, and so on and so forth. That must continue. It is clearly the second best. There is no question that physical closeness helps. But hopefully, these terrific vaccines will work soon, and we'll be able to connect physically before long.
Okay, thank you. Gentlemen, Professor Nusbaum, thank you so much for your great service to the community and to FAN. We're very grateful for your participation. Dr. Jeste, it's a pleasure. Your book, I love your book. I've been reading it. It's so excellent. Thank you so much for illuminating our community. Everyone, thank you for coming. We hope you can join us on November 30th for the Bethencourts. It's going to be a fabulous event, and we hope that we'll see you in just a few minutes at After Hours. Thanks everyone for coming. Have a good evening.